Bad news for consumers on basic food items. Bread prices are expected to rise. Reports say by at least 10% as a result of a 34% increase in the import duty on wheat. Treasury announced a hike in the import duty on Friday, but Grain SA says the increase may not be that steep. Bread is a staple food for poor households, already struggling against increases in the cost of food due to the extended drought. Last week it emerged milk prices are also likely to rise by 60 cents a litre because of the drought effects on milk producers. Bread prices will also be affected by further recent rises in electricity and fuel costs. Well, let's chat to Wandile Sihlobo now, a Grain SA economist, is in our Pretoria studios. Wandile, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Grain SA has been trying for months now to get a significant tariff on wheat imports. We know Treasury announced an import duty hike on Friday. Just to give us some background on why you want these duties on imported wheat.
Thanks, Stephen. I think one thing, Stephen, that just to give a perspective on is that this tariff is not only just something that is coming on at this point. We have been having the whole policy of tariffs in South Africa as early as 1995. And in 2013, Grain SA applied for a review of the reference price and the wheat import tariff, meaning that we were trying to find a balance where it would actually be now to say that if South African farmers were to be paid a certain price for the wheat that they produce, it will be a level which at least will continue to encourage production in a domestic side. The reason for that is just because that South Africa is operating in a global environment where the wheat that is actually produced in anywhere in the world is actually to some extent affecting what's going on in South Africa. And in most of those countries, it's under the environment where it's highly subsidized. So the whole issue of tariff is actually to strike a balance to get a price that will encourage domestic production. And while that is actually ongoing, Grain SA is involved in strategies where we're trying to establish some of the high-yielding wheat varieties to revive the wheat industry. Because if you look in the 80s, South Africa used to produce larger part, about 90% of what we consume, but today we only produce 40% of what we consume. So the tariff is working in encouraging production in that perspective.
Okay, so it's essentially protecting the local industry's viability. But of course, the big consequence is the price of bread. Some reports this morning say that it could be rising by as much as 10% on a loaf. I mean, a suffocating hike, certainly for the poor, isn't it?
I actually noticed the report that were coming out, but one thing I would actually just to highlight is that the increase in the wheat duties, it's about 300 rand on a ton, from 900 rand that the importers were paying in December to actually now about 1,224 that they will be paying. But if you were to look at the loaf of bread in South Africa, on average, it costs about 11 rand 76 cents. And the cost of wheat in that amount that you pay for a loaf of bread is only about 20% of that. If maybe I put it in another words, in a loaf of bread that is consisting of 21 slices, the actual cost of wheat is just around about 4 slices on that. So that means that the increase in the duty of the wheat imports is not necessarily going to result to a 10% increase in a loaf of bread, as reported by some of the other reports, because this increase only sticks in a way that when the international wheat prices drops below a certain level, then the import tariff gets to increase to compensate for those decreases that are actually occurring within the international wheat prices. It does not necessarily add the additional costs in there. So in a way, we're not going to see the 10% increase because of the increase in the wheat import tariff. If the increases are there, it will be some of the other things that are occurring within the value chain. Either it's on the electricity cost, on the baking, and all of those things, but not necessarily linked to what is actually happening within the wheat duties that we're actually going to be seeing. So I'm not really in agreement with that. And I think that consumers, even if now this tariff gets on into place, will continue to enjoy the prices that we are seeing now on the wheat side. And I think that the tariff is to some extent good, because in long term, it means that now we are working towards sustaining the domestic production, the jobs that are within that side of the economy. And And looking on in a bigger scheme, certainly a 34% increase within the duties is not going to result to a 10% increase in a loaf of bread.
All right, so let's just break it down very briefly for a moment here. Just put into context here the contribution to the overall bread price of wheat, then you have electricity and fuel. What's the contributions of each of these items looking like?
I mean, look, if you're looking on, for example, within the production side, it varies on a year-on-year basis. You might find out that the consistent figures that I can give you now, between 15 to 20%, like I emphasize on a larger figure of 20%, that the wheat will be. But if you're to look at the rest of the other 80% that is consistent there in the bread prices, the larger contributor on that will be your transport costs, because what happens is that about 80% of the grain and the products in South Africa are basically moved by road. That means now they're exposed to high toll roads, they're exposed to fuel price fluctuations. The other costs that are in there, your electricity costs, your water costs, your labor costs, as well as some of the other things that gets to be imported that we mix on within this bread. So those are some of the key things that actually might result to an increase in bread prices. But if you're to looking at a raw commodity contribution with this wheat, is certainly not one of the things that could actually drive the bread prices to where some of the other reports have actually been suggesting. And I mean, in the analysis that we have done, we've seen that the response within actually the wheat side has not actually been that much. The other important thing maybe that I may add is that the global wheat prices started falling in the beginning of December 2014, and the tariff was only instituted today out of the announcement that was on Friday, meaning that anybody who's importing wheat in South Africa, they've actually been enjoying around about 313 rand for each and every ton that we've imported from that time up to so far. We've imported 600,000 tons of wheat, and in that they were actually enjoying a benefit or saving of around about 300 rand. And now that with this tariff actually being instituted, that means that they're not going to be able to enjoy that 300. It's going to be driven back towards the other production means. So that's what is being seen as if it's actually the increase, but relatively it's just to strike the balance.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Wandile Sihlobo, Grain SA economist, thanks very much indeed for clearing that up for us. Well, more from the